There's only one person in this world who can tell you who you are. Not you, it's me. Hello guys, I'm back with another episode. I was supposed to record and upload this episode during Pride Month, but your girl is late to holidays, so here I am. Consider this like some sort of like Pride Month sequel. It's just like a continuation of the celebration. Yay! Oh my gosh, like the homophobes are gonna come here and say like, oh my gosh, the veterans only get 1 day. The gays get 1 month. Well, fuck you, I'm extending it now. So ha. Bitch, okay. I know I'm kind of late to the trend, sadly I can't reap the benefits of it being Pride Month and like try to exploit it and get like clout out of it. Here I am with a belated Pride Month celebration. So, happy belated Pride Month, guys. I hope all the queer people were able to have all of their little gay experiences. So basically, this podcast episode is about how to figure out your sexuality. I will be giving some advice within this podcast and my own thoughts on it. This is not a step-by-step tutorial, and coming out and figuring yourself out is going to look different for each person. What I do hope to achieve with this podcast is hopefully you being able to gain some insight if ever you are lost in figuring yourself out or you feel overwhelmed by the amount of terms and the advice and tips that you get like overall. Hopefully this is able to give you some sort of guidance towards like your coming out journey and like figuring out your sexuality, because I know coming out and questioning your sexuality, it's a very draining thing and it can be very stressful and you can feel very lost with it. So I'm just here to hopefully guide you. So with this podcast, not only am I going to be sharing my own personal experiences, but also I'm going to include like other people's advice towards the end. So stay tuned for that. Wow. Also off topic, but different setup today because I'm back at home and I'm not staying at my dorm. If you are like really questioning your sexuality, hopefully this will be able to help you. If you've already figured yourself out, hopefully you can get some like level of relatability with my story or other people's stories. So, yes. I'm going to give a little bit of a background as to what my sexuality is and how I figured it out. That is, if I figured it out. Okay, but basically like my coming out story. I would say like I started questioning my sexuality mainly during grade 7. Prior to that, I just sort of thought that since I was like, I presented very feminine and I felt very comfortable with that. And I would say that I've had like crushes on guys like prior to like grade 7. So I just like said like, oh, I'm straight. But like during grade 7, there was this like one time when I asked my friend group, I asked them, hypothetically, if you were a guy, which among our girl classmates would you date? And then I thought it was just like, oh, it's a hypothetical question. Like, it's not that deep. All of them looked at me like, why are you asking that question? Like, why are you asking that? I was like, yeah, no, like, hypothetically, as friends, we would have, like, other hypothetical scenarios. Like, suddenly, this one was fucking weird? And they were like, and do you have something to tell us? Like, and then I got like super defensive because I had like an answer ready for that. And they just like asked me like, who would you date among our classmates? And then I gave them the name of like one of our classmates. Ever since then, like this one friend that I have, like she's like still one of my closest friends up until this point. She was like the main person that helped me figure out my sexuality. Shout out to you, Red. Love you so much. She just kept on teasing me with this like one classmate that I mentioned before. So ever since then, I was like, am I like, I was like, I've had like crushes on guys in the past. So I was like, okay, I'm straight. So I was like talking about it with them more. I would like say that I'm straight. And then they were like, I mean, you could be bi. I was like, what's that? They were like, you could be bisexual. I was like, oh, really? Sometime during the pandemic, I started questioning my sexuality again. And obviously, that was when like we were stuck at home, like we had nothing else to do, so that left like a lot of room for introspection. Sometime during the pandemic, I downloaded TikTok. I was immediately placed in like queer media TikTok, and there were a lot of like TikToks about like bisexuality and stuff. So that was when like I was like actually like introduced like in more in depth of like what bisexuality was. So I was like, that's interesting. At some point I was like, okay. To that like friend of mine, my friend Red, I just messaged her saying like, okay, I think I'm bi. And she was like, finally you figured it out. I was like, okay, fuck you, by the way. Fuck you. This goes out to that one friend who figured out your sexuality before you. Looking back, I definitely had like crushes on girls. Like even prior to like grade 7, like I would definitely have like crushes on like other girls that I knew, and I would like really look up to them, and I would like really want to be close to them, but I wasn't sure in what way. When I was like 13, like during the pandemic, like grade 8, that was when I was like, okay, I am secure with the label bisexual. And then sometime last year, I started like questioning my sexuality again. I was in a relationship at the time, and it was like a queer relationship. So, since it was my first relationship, I just thought like, oh, this was the first person I've ever like loved this deeply, I'd say. Prior to this, I would never have like any sort of situationships, or I would have very limited like romantic experiences. Like yes, there were like crushes that I had, but it never really progressed. Like yes, there were people that I would like talk to, or people that I would try to get to know, or like people that I would have a crush on, but like none of them were really that quote unquote deep. Aside from like this like one person that I was deeply infatuated by for like a good 2 years, like prior to like me dating this person. I realized that I just craved validation from that person. I'm not sure if I actually like love them in a way. I'm revealing a lot about my love life on here. So sometime last year I started like questioning my sexuality again. And I thought like, since it's the first like relationship that I've been with, am I just gay? Like am I really that attracted to men at that point? Like because I noticed that like I never really loved the guy that deeply. But like after we broke up, I just realized that oh, it's just because that was the only person I've ever been in a relationship with. That's another thing with like bisexuality. It feels as though like when you're in like a relationship with like one person, it feels as though like, oh, what if I'm only attracted to this gender of like the person that I'm dating? So it's sort of a mind fuck. Like, yes, when you like choose to engage like in a monogamous relationship with like a person, yes, you do have to pick. But like, isn't that the point of like bisexuality? Is like you don't have to pick. But yeah, anyways, and then sometime like after the relationship, I started questioning whether or not I was aro. The activities that I would do with like in my relationship, it didn't really differ much to the activities that I would do with my like friendships and stuff. They were still like stuff that I would do with them. The only difference with my like previous relationship was that I could entertain the idea of having sex. Aside from like sexual attraction, like what's the real distinction between like romantic and platonic relationships that I have? The only distinction that I really had was like importance and like prioritization. I just thought like, okay, I'm going to prioritize like my really close friendships and my relationship first. In terms of like who I would hang out with, like in terms of like what I would spend money on for gifts, like that's like something tangible that I could like allocate in terms of like internal attraction to them. I didn't really see much of a difference. But yeah, so like for a while I did think I was aro. I'm still entertaining the idea that I could possibly be aro, but also I'm not really that sure. Right now, what I identify with is queer. Like I do date both genders right now casually. So right now I'm just switching between like bisexual and queer and possibly aro. So aside from like me questioning whether or not I was aro, there was like a period of time like last year I thought that I was a lesbian. Yes, I was in a relationship with my girlfriend. I was also like sort of unsure, like does this dismiss like the men that I was attracted, like that I had a crush on before? Was that just compet? I seriously question whether or not I was attracted to men because I was just like very off put by them. Things that like my straight female friends or my gay male friends things that they would find like hot, things that they would like gush over, they weren't like the same things that I would find attractive. Like I didn't have the same reaction as them. So I was like, is this just like me being a man hater, or is this like something else? I was like, okay. But yeah, I did question whether or not I was a lesbian for a while. So that's why right now I identify as queer. You might be questioning, like, oh, why am I going to take advice on figuring out my sexuality from somebody who hasn't fully figured out their sexuality? Hear me out, hear me out. It would be better to take advice from somebody who has actively struggled with like figuring out the label for their sexuality, or who has been through the journey of like figuring out their sexuality, rather than somebody who just like figured it out like right away. Aside from the fact that you could find a level of relatability with my experience, there's also this like, since I've been through the journey, or like other people who are also figuring out their sexuality, they've been through the journey of heavy introspection and like their thought processes behind like questioning their sexuality and their attraction. They will be able to give you like more in-depth insight as to how to figure it out for yourself. So hopefully like the advice that I'm going to give in this podcast is like, oh, like my credibility is now bullshit because like I haven't figured it myself out. We're all in this together, guys. We're all figuring ourselves out. This is a journey, and we're just along for the ride, I guess. The next thing I wanted to talk about is in terms of how exactly sexuality and attraction is shaped, and whether or not you are born this way, or whether or not it is something that changes throughout time. Your attraction and sexuality is something inherent within you. However, I also do believe that there's this phrase like sexuality is fluid. Like I do believe that your sexuality is something inherent within you. Like it's obviously not something that can be changed easily, or that not exactly something that can be like forced on you depending on like certain behaviors that are pushed onto you, or certain practices that like could like possibly change your sexuality. I also think that sexuality is fluid and it can evolve over time. But what exactly do people mean by your sexuality is fluid? Basically, how like in your environment or other factors are going to change and evolve your sexuality over time. Does this mean that sexuality is something you can forcibly change? No. So to the people saying like, oh, if you're born this way, like why can't we just like shape you and change you to just become straight and normal like the rest of us? Fuck off, by the way. But also, in terms of like how you perceive your sexuality, how you perceive your attraction to other people, yes, it's going to be affected by other factors. Do you simply call yourself straight, or do you simply date the opposite gender simply because society tells you so? That is something that could influence how you perceive your sexuality. I think that's also like important to consider as well. Obviously, with like compet, is like being surrounded by other queer people. Does it allow you to be more comfortable with expressing your sexuality? Or if you are exposed to like a lot of queer people but you still consider yourself straight, there are so many like varying experiences and varying like factors that could possibly influence your sexuality or change the way that you perceive your own sexuality, to where it's like you can't find like a causal factors to like, oh, this is why you're gay. Along with that is there are also different kinds of attraction. Obviously, there is like romantic attraction, there's sexual attraction, there's platonic attraction, there's intellectual attraction. There are probably more that a person can possibly experience, but those are like the main ones. And the main things that like people consider when determining their attraction and sexuality is probably like sexual and romantic attraction. The others like probably fall into like just more general categories, but like in terms of labeling your sexuality, that's what the main things they consider sexual and romantic attraction. The thing is, the way that I see this is, I would say that each connection that you have with each person is going to be vastly different. Obviously, your connection with one friend of yours is going to be different from another friend of yours, and like your partner. I would say like each of them are going to be different. The reason why we as humans are more likely to perceive like certain relationships as like platonic, or like certain relationships as more romantic, is mainly because it's for the mere fact that it is easier to categorize like these sort of relationships and people. That's not necessarily like a bad thing, and saying like, oh, you're minimizing these like relationships to just like putting people in categories. Like that's just something like that's just something like our human brains do to make things easier to comprehend. I saw this reel that was like, aside from exclusivity and sex, what is the main distinction between your romantic relationships and your platonic relationships? Something I realized from the comments was that no person had like a distinct characteristic that was like exclusive to romantic relationships. So this was during the time when I was trying to figure out whether I was aro. When I was trying to like figure out whether or not I was aro, I like just came to the realization that the main distinction that I have in terms of like my romantic relationships is just what is like socially acceptable for you, or like socially acceptable activities or actions that you are able to do with them. When I like talk to other people asking them about their like perspectives, and like when I also looked at the comments of that reel, the fact that you imagine like a future with this person and you plan out a future with them. But then I like started thinking like, I have planned out like futures with all of like my closest friends. We've planned out vacations together. Like once we reach this age and once we reach this like level of financial capacity, this is what we'll do. Like once we've graduated and like we're financially independent, like, oh, we'll move in together, like we'll be roommates. And it's like there's still like a level of like long-term planning when it comes to like deep friendships. But like, why is that something that is seen as like exclusive to like romantic relationships? Yes, there's exclusivity as well. You only call this one person your partner, but can call multiple people your friend. But there's also like polyamorous relationships. I guess like the main distinction with like poly people, and it's like there's a level of dating, there's a level of flirting to them. Like that could be like a possible distinction. Then I thought to myself, like, I flirt with all of my friends playfully. Like, me and my friends, we also go on like romantic dates. Or like dates that would be considered romantic if we weren't friends. There's also this rise of people like taking their friends out on dates in order to like raise their standards for their romantic relationships. And I just think like that is stuff that I've been doing like even before it became like some sort of trend. That was something that I was already doing, and I didn't necessarily do that because like I don't want like your future boyfriend or your future girlfriend to like treat you any worse than this. I did it because like I enjoy doing these things, and like these are with people that I care about and that I love very deeply. So, and then there's like sexual attraction. But the thing is like sexual attraction is like something like separate. Like people are also capable of like having like casual sexual like encounters. They're not considered like romantic in a way. There's friends with benefits, there's fubus. So it's like having sexual attraction for someone like its own thing. It's not like the distinctive factor on like what you would consider romantic. I just thought like if you have platonic attraction and you have sexual attraction, that means it's romantic. So like romantic attraction is just like a mixture of these two. Basically what had me in a mind fuck for a couple months, but I've just come to the conclusion that your connection with each person is very unique to one another. What you consider a romantic relationship is probably going to be like very unique to you, and how you view romantic relationships, like from what you see from other people, from what you see from media. That's the thing about like human relationships. They're very diverse. They're very varied. And that is like a common theme that you're going to like see within this podcast. So, yeah, we love diversity over here. So in terms of like labeling your sexuality, what exactly is the point of like labeling your sexuality? Prior to heteronormative standards and like prior to colonialism and like homophobia and stuff like that, what's the point now of like labeling your sexuality? Like if those like things didn't exist, like can't people just like who they like, love who they love, you know, hate who they hate, I guess. If like your attraction and connection with other people is like so unique to one another, why is there this need to like put a label on what your sexuality is? I have two main reasons for this. The first one is probably like the most self-explanatory. It's just that it gives you a sense of assurance in who you are. As I said, like it's easier for humans to like categorize things and put labels on things because it makes it easier to comprehend. And it allows you to, I guess, compartmentalize like, oh, the kinds of relationships that you can have. The second reason is it also allows you to be able to shape how other people are able to perceive you. And in a way, it also allows for you to be able to like quote unquote market yourself to other people and like within the dating market. So like for example, if you say that you are a lesbian, you are able to like signal to fellow lesbians or fellow Woolowas that you're open to dating them. Same thing with like other sexualities. That's what it allows you to do, which is why like in a way I was sort of hesitant about labeling myself as queer or aro, because if I identified as queer, it felt like yes, it was like like queer is a proper label, but I didn't feel as though I had like a proper target market. I know this sounds so like capitalistic and shit, but I thought that if I labeled myself as queer, it felt as though like, oh, I'm just like open to anyone, and it felt too broad and not like specific, and it felt as though I didn't have like a proper target market to who I would date. I'm not sure if that's like a normal way of thinking about it, but like that's how like one of the first things I thought about. And then like when I considered like whether or not I was aro, if I started like telling people I was aro, it had this implication that I was like blocking myself of like certain dating experiences, and I was sort of afraid that I was like pushing certain people that I could have been like open to like dating and getting to know. Like I would have been like pushing them away. Which is like a part of the reason why I'm like hesitant about like identifying with those labels as opposed to the label of bisexual, wherein it is something that is more acceptable nowadays, or it's like more people have an understanding of what bisexuality is, so there isn't much explaining that I had to do for other people. It's also just easier to explain what bisexuality is to straight people if ever they don't know what it is. It's like, oh, you like boys and girls. But with queer, it's like, oh, it's an umbrella term for people who are not straight, and like, or like aro, like, oh, they have like little to romantic attraction, but also they're like, I'm still open to like dating people, like this is how it is like for me, like it exists on like there's a lot of explanation that has to go on with like identifying with other labels that aren't as like generally agreed upon. So sometimes it's just easier to say I'm bi. The next thing that I sort of want to talk about is in terms of the perception of queer people. I'm going to specifically be talking about the portrayal of queer characters in Filipino media, because that was what mainly shaped my perception of gender and sexuality. So, the reason why I thought like if I presenting as very feminine and I have been like shown to like boys in the past, I just thought like, okay, I'm straight. The reason why I had that sort of mindset before was mainly because I grew up with like Filipino family movies. I grew up with Vice Ganda, and I also had like a lot of gay ninongs. Like I was surrounded by a lot of gay ninongs growing up. So I had this perception of like this is how queer people are, and if I don't fit into that like category, like okay, I'm straight. The main movie that like shaped my perception of sexuality and gender was Girl Boy Bakla Tomboy. Goodness gracious, ikaw yung nag-shoplift. But like that was like the pinnacle of what I thought like queer people were portrayed as. Like I thought that since I am a cis woman and identify with I like feminine things and stuff, I was like, okay, I'm girly. Oh my gosh, my shirt is giving girly. You were the one caught stealing on CCTV. That's why I like thought that, oh, in that case, like I can't like girls because I am not a mask. I'm not a tomboy. Like in a lot of mainstream Filipino movies, there was still like a represent, like even back then, like there was still like a level of representation for queer people. Like they were definitely exposed in media, and it was different like compared to like let's say like with Western media, where they had to like put like queer characters like occasionally, like there would be like one gay man and he would be very like straight passing and stuff, either very straight passing or very flamboyant. But with Filipino media, there was this expectation for the gay men in Filipino media to be very flamboyant and very expressive, and usually in terms of like the queer characters in these movies and TV shows, they would usually be a side character. They would be the one delivering a punchline. They would be there to add more personality and comedic value to the show. They weren't seen as like a main driver of the storyline. They weren't seen as actual characters in the show. They were just like there. They were just there to like add a little bit of giggles to the show. With the gay men in Filipino media, like with Vice Ganda and other very visibly like gay flamboyant men in Filipino media, they would usually be the ones like having like the quick-witted remarks. They would usually just be there to entertain. Filipino gay men humor does it definitely shapes a lot of Filipino humor nowadays. It definitely shapes a lot of like mainstream language and like slang that is used in Filipino conversations. Like that's definitely like humor that I engage with like when I speak Tagalog with my other friends. It's like when they are portrayed in media, that's all they offer. If they aren't there to be like happy-go-lucky or give a punchline, there's not much else to them. It's very rare to see like some sort of depth to the character, like other personality traits aside from being flamboyant. I would even accept like if it was done well, like negative personality traits of these like queer people in media, if it was done like tastefully, obviously. But no, it's usually they're one-dimensional. At most, they're going to give like a short sob story about how their parents didn't accept them growing up, or like they had like a homophobic parent, they got kicked out. Or it would be the contrast to that, wherein they had like very supportive parents, they're overly supportive. And usually those two extremes don't feel realistic to like queer people who are watching the show. Aside from gay men, there's also like the portrayal of lesbians on TV shows. The tomboys. Usually in those cases, like they have even less, like queer women have even less representation. The only times you would see a lesbian on screen is if they're portrayed as a tomboy. Usually about middle-aged, they have a pixie haircut. They're very masculine. If the gay men are delivering a punchline, there's a good chance that the punchline itself or the butt of the joke is going to be the tomboy. Aside from that, like usually they won't be considered like conventionally attractive since they don't fit the feminine Eurocentric beauty standard that the Filipino audience wants. So they're just like there. And even then, there's like very little representation. If there is like some sort of representation in like Filipino pop culture, it is usually like, oh, sayang ka if like you're a lesbian. A prime example of this is Jake Zyrus or like Charisse before. One of the few Filipino representatives to like hit the global market. Like, with Glee, with like other songs, like they were like very popular in like the early 2010s, I'd say. Yeah, or like the 2010s. And then he came out as Jake Zyrus, came out as trans. That was when his popularity started to decline. Obviously, it had to do with like the perceptions at that time. The main things that like people on the internet would say was in terms of like, oh, it's such a waste. Like such like wasted potential whenever they would portray queer women on screen. Like whenever they would portray queer women or like tomboys on screen, it's just like if they used to be really feminine and like conventionally attractive and then they say that they're gay or like a lesbian, it's like, oh, it's such a waste. That was sort of why before, like, I had like this disgusted reaction with myself when I considered the possibility that I might be gay. Even though, like, prior to that, since I was like surrounded by my gay ninongs, like, I was surrounded by like a lot of queer culture and media, like Filipino queer culture at that, I was like, I would like call myself an ally, and I was very like outspoken about like gay issues. Like I was the biggest ally that there was. Like I was like, why am I getting disgusted at myself for something that I used to support so heavily? It was like sort of hurtful to see that my parents were so loving and supportive of like my gay ninongs, supportive of like the gay men that they would see on screen. But even then, I was still so worried on like how they would perceive me if ever I were to come out to them. It felt so scary for me to like disappoint them with this news that like, oh, I'm not who they thought I was. That's where I lie right now. So I just really wish that aside from having like more representation of like queer women in like Filipino media, also just like a more diverse selection of like queer characters showing different experiences so that like each queer person has like someone that they are able to relate to. Just more in-depth, well-written characters. Yeah, diversity, because like queer characters before like falling into like one of two categories, either super supportive parents or like deeply homophobic and hateful parents. It's like usually parents of queer people, they don't fall into one of those categories. They will likely be like some sort of variation of homophobic or some sort of variation of supportive, or like yeah, just like somewhere in between. It's just like so confusing to like watch as like a queer person and like trying to relate to these people, but like you can't fully relate to them. I'd like to like talk about the biphobia that is going around recently. So basically, there was this TikTok that went viral where there is this bisexual woman who says that they would never date a woman. And that TikTok itself, it was mainly just like a clickbaity like hook and title. So as like she went on in the video, she talked about like in terms of like just her like preferences like overall, and like how she is sexually and romantically attracted to women, and she has dated women before and stuff like that. That's not what I'm going to like critique in this video. What I mainly wanted to talk about is in terms of the reactions towards that video and how it affects like the biphobia that is happening today. Like what is it recently? Like, why is there so much fucking biphobia? A possible reason as to why I might have like revoked my bisexuality card to like identify as queer or like aro, or like the reason why I like started to deviate from the bisexual label sometime last year was it could have just been like internalized biphobia, but it could also be from the way that people would portray bisexuals, or the way that people would gatekeep being bisexual, especially online or with like fellow bisexuals within the queer community. A lot of people online would sort of categorize this like certain group of bisexual women who choose to exclusively have more sexual relationships with women as opposed to romantic relationships with women. They would sort of categorize this as women who are like performing for the male gaze. Basically, they're not real bisexuals and we don't want to identify with them as a community. And then that sort of became like, in order for you to identify as bisexual, you have to fit this certain attraction and like this certain criteria in order for you to identify as a label. This was like an idea that was brought up by one of my friends, but when men choose to engage in more sexual relationships with women, they are not denied their heterosexuality. If anything, like usually they're more praised for it. They're still considered straight even if they choose to exclusively have multiple sexual relations with women, like even in a casual sense. But the moment that a bisexual woman chooses to primarily engage in sexual relations with other women, they are revoked of their bisexuality and they're seen as fake bisexuals. Yes, I will acknowledge that there are certain women who feel as though kissing other women, having sex with other women is seen as hot by men because like they fetishize stuff like that. Like I will acknowledge that it is a possible reason as to why women are going to engage in like sexual acts with other women despite not like quote unquote being attracted to them. The thing with that is you won't fully know the reason as to why these people will like engage in these like sexual endeavors. To police and say like certain women are not actual bisexuals because they primarily have like romantic relationships with men and they're not queer the moment that they do so, basically just defeats the point of bisexuality. This just goes to show that people view sexuality as a spectrum. It's not black and white until it comes to bisexuals. And then it becomes like, oh, you have to fit these certain requirements in order for you to identify as a bisexual, or else you're not a real bisexual and you're bad for the community and you're bad representation and you should fuck off. Another thing I wanted to like talk about is in terms of micro labels. The way that I view micro labels is, since vocabulary expands and since like society progresses, it is likely that there are going to be terms that are developed in order to explain like more complex and in-depth topics. And that's the same thing with micro labels. The thing with micro labels is it allows for people to find the term to explain the very complex attraction that they are able to feel. This goes back to my point earlier on how like humans are more likely to want to like categorize and compartmentalize things because it is just easier for them to comprehend. Micro labels have sort of become like a double-edged sword, wherein like there is such an abundance of like micro labels. A good portion of them aren't necessarily like commonly used. They're just there in order to explain like very complex attractions that like a certain like like a small percentage of people could possibly feel. As like micro labels become more and more prominent within society, it feels as though it divides the community even more. It like places like the LGBTQ plus community, which is supposed to be like, you know, a community with a bunch of people and supposed to be very diverse. It puts people in like certain categories, and this is like where you're supposed to be placed. Which in terms of like the LGBTQ plus community, them being able to function as a movement, certain individuals within the community feel as though they are not responsible for the causes like of another like category within the community. It also just makes people feel more like distant and isolated from each other within the movement. However, with queerness, I do believe that it is more about getting rid of the divide and embracing that fluidity within the movement. And the micro labels are just like something additional. But at the end of the day, no matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgender life, we're all in this together. Speaking of micro labels, or like just like labels in sexuality in general, with queerness you're supposed to be embracing deviating from the social norm, or embracing like diversity and like fluidity in terms of your attraction to people, and then like placing certain like restrictions and requirements in order for people to identify with this certain label. I find it so draining and so tiring whenever I see people like that. Because that is something very common that I see like with the people that I'm surrounded by, wherein they feel as though, oh, since I've observed like these behaviors from you in the past, and you now identify with this certain label, it's now performative and like you're just faking your attraction. Why do you know this person better than they know themselves? And also your basis for making this conclusion about them is like what you see externally, like you don't see them like in their day-to-day lives. You have like a limited perception of this person, and you're going to be policing them on how they're going to identify as. Well, I do like, yes, I will acknowledge, before people like fucking call me out for this, yes, I will acknowledge that there are certain people who identify with these labels and they exhibit behaviors that could possibly be harmful towards the overall perception of the people within the community. I'm not talking about those, okay? Maybe like the next time like somebody comes out to you and they start to like exhibit behaviors that deviate from what you traditionally perceive as like people who identify within that group, try to like dig deeper instead of like immediately going to judging them. There are definitely other factors that will affect how people exhibit their sexuality like outwardly, and how they are likely to perceive their own attraction that is individual to them. That is obviously not going to be black and white, and that's obviously going to be able to evolve and change. Just because like you say something evolves, it means like it's better than the previous. It just means that like, oh, it's different than the previous thing. There are going to be like varying circumstances as to what leads people to identify a certain way, or how it leads people to view themselves. Okay, so now I'm going to read some of the responses that I put on my story. On my story, I put, how did you figure out your sexuality, or any tips on people who are figuring it out? Somebody said, tip, talk to other queer people about their experiences. That's very true. Having a good, like, community or circle of queer friends who are able to share their experiences, having different perspectives and, like, stories is a really good way to, like, figure out what your sexuality is. To be honest, I realized I got the same feeling of having a crush with people of all genders. I interestingly and fortunately never had to. I realized I liked a girl and therefore liked women. Good for you. Somebody said, always trust yourself more than the input you get from other people. Literally. That is so real, actually. So, if anything, you can, like, nullify everything I say in this podcast or any advice that other people say in this. Just trust yourself. Because most likely, you know yourself better than I know you. You know yourself better than other people know you. And there's no such thing as, like, a wrong label or identifying yourself the wrong way. That's something that I had to learn. Turns out I dated a girl to get my parents' approval. Let me know how that went. Anyways, this person said finding out girls can like girls through social media at 13. This person said, I didn't. I'm still unlabeled and happy that way. I think if it's too hard to label, then simply don't. There's no need to put a label if you don't want to. The benefits of having a label for your sexuality is you're able to have a level of self-assurance and you're able to market yourself on the dating market. But aside from that, if you already have that level of self-assurance and your dating life is fine, like without a label, then go for it. This person said, seriously got curious and kissed a girl from Bumble when I was 14 and liked it. That's really fucking gay. Oh, this person said, whoever makes your heart beat faster when you're around them and makes you nervous. Okay, wait. I have my thoughts on this, and this is, like, sort of off topic from what, like, I talked about earlier. The reason why I was, like, so confused on, like, what exactly I consider, like, romantic attraction was because, like, people would say, like, if this person makes your heart beat faster. But there's also, like, other people who say, like, if this person makes your heart skip a beat. So which one is it? Actually, if my heart rate is faster or if my heart rate is slower, because it seems as though both of these means that you like the person romantically. But also, how the fuck do I identify if it's, like, faster than usual or slower than usual? Do I need a fucking heart rate monitor to figure out whether or not I like someone? I don't get it. I seriously don't. So, like, I don't know. Could just be adrenaline, could just be your heart rate is slower, could be cholesterol, could be low iron. This person replied to my story and it was a really long message. And this person said, when I was a kid, there were a couple of girls that made me think if I was a boy, I'd have a crush on her. I thought I was weird, a defect, because all my friends only ever had crushes on boys. It wasn't until I saw that I wasn't the only one who felt this way did I figure out that nothing was wrong with me. I didn't have to be a boy to like girls. Girls can like girls too. Seeing media, whether that's films, books, or even social media posts that depicted homosexuality as something as normal and not taboo like my religious upbringing did, helped me figure out a lot more who I was and how much of it was left undiscovered because I was in a situation where I was denied an avenue to explore non-heteronormative narratives of sexuality. I suppose my experience is an example of why queer isn't something instilled upon you or something you can turn off. Because even though I was raised in a family that believed that homosexuality was a sin, I still turned out the way I did and experienced love the way I do. I'm not out to my parents, but it does feel better to know that this is natural and I am not an anomaly for having these feelings for people of the same gender. Happy Pride indeed. Yay! Happy Pride. I had a very similar experience wherein I thought, like, in order for you to like girls, you had to be a boy. So I just thought, like, oh, I had to, like, transition into a guy in order to like a girl, which sounds like a very weird thought process now that I think about it. But yeah, that was, like, what I grew up with. To an extent, I guess, like, the whole girl boy bakla tomboy and, like, Filipinos' perception on what queerness is, it's very heavily affected by heteronormativity. Because even though, like, yes, it is more accepted that, like, there is a bakla in your family or there's a tomboy in your family. Like, yes, that is something that is expected, but if you're not depicted in the way that people are used to, which is like if you're a gay man, you're very flamboyant, you're very like entertaining, you have a punchline for everything, very witty. If you're a tomboy, you're more like masculine, you're more like rugged and more butch, I guess. If you're not seen as that way, there is this automatic assumption that okay, you're straight. If you do identify with those, like you're automatically assumed to be gay. It's queer, but also there is like a there are certain characteristics you have to fill. There's certain criteria that you have to fulfill as well in order for you to fit within that like category of people. That same logic is being pushed towards like bisexuality, because to be fair, bisexuality is a relatively like newer concept. Not newer concept, like yes, obviously bisexuality probably existed, but like bisexual was mainly popularized not too long ago, probably like early 2000s, because I remember like when I watched Sex and the City, and there was this one episode that was dedicated towards like bisexuality, and like Carrie dating a bisexual man. Almost the entire friend group's perception, aside from Samantha, thought that either straight or gay. You pick a side and you stay there. Like, just choose. You're being too greedy if you want both genders. God forbid a girl wants to be fucking greedy. But, like, that was mainly how, like, people perceived bisexuality back then. There hasn't been much time in order for like the perception of bisexuality to progress past that. Yes, there have been change. Like not a lot of people think bisexuality is a phase now. Not as many people think bisexuality is a phase now. People do see bisexuality as a valid form of attraction. The other thing in terms of like you having a religious upbringing and still identifying as queer, your sexuality is not something that can be forcibly changed. It can't be something that can be converted. Although I don't like using like certain anecdotes of like, oh, I grew up in a religious family, but I still identify as queer, or like through the power of Jesus Christ, I was able to identify as straight, or like taking these like small anecdotes to like show that this is possible, so that should be pushed towards like a general majority of people. I don't like using like small anecdotes like that to like push a certain narrative like, oh, this is possible, because obviously each person's situation is going to be different, and each person has different circumstances to where actually all the time it's not going to apply to you. While I did say that other people's experiences could possibly help you figure out your sexuality, that's a lie. I'm just kidding. Hopefully, hearing about other people's experiences, or like hearing about my experience with sexuality, or like my thoughts on sexuality and labels and stuff like that, and queerness, hopefully they're able to sort of shape and mold your perception on attraction and sexuality. Hopefully it's able to like possibly guide you towards the right direction. That is, if there is a right direction. The right direction is whichever one you choose. Good luck to everybody who's still figuring out their sexuality. Hope you guys had a happy Pride Month. And bye bye. Mwah.